A Glance in the Mirror, Chapter 25, National Service. In 1948, the government decreed that all men over the age of 18 were to take part in 2 years' national service in one of the 3 main armed services. Most of the recruits went into the army, where the relatively short period of 2 years allowed sufficient basic infantry training to be taught. The Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force needed men who required skills that took longer to perfect. National service could be deferred, ensuring apprenticeships and training schemes could be completed before entering. Terry elected to do his national service during his apprenticeship and serve an extra year to make up for the 2 lost years, meaning Terry would be out of his time a journeyman by the age of 21. Because he had joined the Royal Marine Volunteer Reserves for 9 years, he was allowed to serve his 2 years in that corps. A group of lads in the Boys Brigade decided to join the Royal Marine Forces Volunteer Reserve, based at Morgate in London. It was the thrill of the challenge and, of course, the uniform and name which drove them on. By signing on for 9 years, it allowed their national service to be served in a unit that would not normally take 2-year entrance. And meanwhile, Terry's best friend David Villas left North London Polytechnic to start a job with a northern-based newspaper as a trainee sports correspondent. It needed the excitement of joining up to take away the sadness of losing such a fine friend. After being kitted out by the quartermaster, the group attended lectures on the history of the Corps, and then they fell in for basic drill. The language used by the drill sergeant was friendly and informal. Great emphasis was made that the detachment was a unit that worked by common consent. The squad came together for talks on tactics and weapon maintenance and familiarization, attending many lectures in the evening. It didn't take many weeks before they were considered fit to march out in public, wearing the uniform on every occasion. Terry changed into his kit at work after everyone else had left for home. It was 1952. Most of Terry's weekends were now booked for rifle shooting. They were all 17 and thought themselves fit for anything. Every weekend, 10 arrived at the Morgate Drill Hall, where a Royal Navy truck took them to one of the 2 rifle ranges, Bickley or Purbright. Their Saturday nights were spent in the huts close to the rifle range. There was no fear about what they should do with their spare time, for every waking moment was wrapped up in all things military, especially in commando training. The squad's commando training took place on the northern Welsh hills, where camping out was normally held during the winter. Route and speed marches organised for groups and pairs included climbing Snowdon. Map reading and survival training were all part of the experience. No one dropped out or questioned what they were all given to do. Basic military infantry training with a modicum of armed combat, cliff climbing, rope work, plus the usual assault courses. After attending regularly for over 9 months and passing a series of commando exercises in the Welsh hills, route marches and target practice, they finally climbed Snowdon at a set speed, which earned them a green beret. Terry's call-up papers arrived through the letterbox the week he was 18. He was keen to go and get started. He said his goodbyes to the men at work and his parents, and gathering his things together on that exciting day in September 1953, he made his way to North Harrow Station for the train to take him to Baker Street and then onwards to Waterloo Main Line Station. He arrived there in good time and travelled down to Lympstone in Devon in company with some other lads who were also joining up. He had to leave his uniform behind to be reissued. His infantry training, which was to take 17 weeks, was to prepare him for basic service life. He was to be one of the 50 men to make up 843 Squad, which was then split into 2 groups in 2 huts, both groups led by Colour Sergeant Snowdon. The companies were allotted their hut with a corporal in charge of each, and during their training they had instruction on personal hygiene, how to wash and iron, how to clean their teeth, what to wear, how to wear it, and how to clean it. Corps history emphasized, reinforced by a simple written test, contraceptive matters explained, and a medical given, with an attendant jab and inoculation. No part of daily existence was forgotten. There was no shouting, bullying or swearing by the officers or NCOs. It was a carefully planned training exercise of how to behave and live in a closely confined unit. Every man who passed the entrance exams was accepted whatever his height. There was an emphasis on initiative, freedom of movement and a choice of weapons to be carried for a specific task. During their initial training, they had to make a choice which wing of the Royal Marines they were to continue their service with. They had a choice between 4-5 Commando who were in Malaya, Amphibious section based in Poole Harbour, or sea service on one of Her Majesty's ships. Having been in the Commandos, Terry elected to go into sea service, fancying a trip round the world with sunshine, grass-skirted native girls, the sound of Hawaiian chants, and the sun glittering on the wave tops round Gibraltar, Singapore and Barbados. What a shock he was going to have. He was accepted for sea service and sent to Whale Island Gunnery School, Portsmouth, with a small attachment to attend a gunnery course scheduled to last 4 weeks. Here all recruits had to double march to all lectures, demonstrations and practices. It was freezing cold, being in midwinter, and it snowed most of the time he was there. The practices completed firing the 4.7 guns, the standard gunnery piece. All the equipment was old and much used, evident by the amount of paint that had been built up on the carriages. The 4 training weeks went by quickly. Soon the squad was to be found hanging around the company notice board to see what ships they had been allocated to. At last his name appeared, telling him to present himself to Portsmouth Harbour, where HMS Illustrius, a large, by British standards, aircraft carrier taking on stores and additional crew. Built by Vickers Armstrong and launched in April the 5th, 1939, was commissioned a year later at Barrow to carry 52 aircraft. The ship was now nearly 20 years old. Terry was one of half a dozen Royal Marines who had to present themselves to the officer of the watch, get themselves new kit, be issued with a hammock, shown their mess, and where and how to sling their hammock. They were surprisingly comfortable to sleep in. Heave-o, lash and stow greeted them every morning, after being invited to show a leg. Whilst on board, Terry struck up a friendship with another Marine who had his coxswain's ticket for dinghy sailing. He asked Terry if he would like to crew for him, and thereafter, wherever HMS Illustrious entered port, if suitable harbour facilities allowed, they would launch the general-purpose GP-14 dinghy and have a sail. This they did on many occasions, becoming quite expert at launching and coming into position to be hoisted inboard. To launch, they had to arrange for a forklift driver to carry the boat out of the hangar onto the lift and deposit it under the crane. Then the crane driver would drop the boat over the side to position it next to the gangway ladder. Any wind under a force 5, which was not about to increase, then they could sail. If a gale was imminent, a cone was hoisted. This warning had to be obeyed to return on board immediately. On one occasion in Belfast, they went out on a lovely day in a force 3 wind and sailed for over an hour, testing themselves on going about and close hauling into the wind. By this time they were quite some way away from the ship and didn't notice that the wind speed was increasing. When they thought they ought to return, they looked to the ship and saw that they had hoisted a cone. Terry and his companion set a course to return, only to discover that the wind and tide was now against them, driving them on shore and into Belfast Bay. They started tacking furiously, trying to make headway, and by this time even they could see that the waves were getting up, and didn't need to be told that getting hoisted was going to be tricky. At last they came up to the ship to see that she was steaming before the wind and tide, which didn't allow them any lead to shelter from the wind, but gave shelter from the tide for hoisting in board. The officer of the watch was there, as well as the guards and duty crane driver. The side of the aircraft carrier is, I suppose, as high as a 5-foot block of flats. The sides curve outwards and upwards, overhanging anything beneath, all accentuating height, weight and mass, and is extremely intimidating. This was now all becoming decidedly dodgy and embarrassing, and they knew that the flight deck personnel would be attending the steam catapult gear for repairs, for they had been there when they had left. There were times in Terry's life when he would dearly have wished to have been many miles away from where he was, and this was another one of those moments. What would have been ideal was a very slick pick-up of the hook, and then to make a speedy exit from the scene. This was not to be. They came up to the trailing ropes attached to the extended boom, which was projecting out from the ship's sides. Booms, perhaps 2 or more on either side of the ship, had trailing ropes for small boats to tie up to, and rope ladders for small boats to exit and entry. Having got into position, the crane driver lowered the pulley and hook. They could see that the choppiness of the water, which by this time had a 4 to 5 foot rise and fall, meant they had to position the boat perfectly to make a smart pick-up possible. This had to be done at the bottom of the wave trough, lest becoming suspended. Now, if you can imagine the scene, a large pulley block and hook about the size of a small car wheel, and weighing perhaps 100 weight, with 4 pieces of spliced wire, each with their spliced eyelet, for attaching to the dinghy, and all swaying about above your head, whilst you're rising and falling with the waves. Nasty. Now all that is bad enough, if there is just you, your mate, and the crane driver in attendance. But in this case, all their antics were being observed with great interest by a gathering group of well-wishers, and an even greater group of loafers who had made up their minds that, because they had had a boring day, wanted to be entertained, especially by 2 dozy marines in trouble. It was very difficult to stay up with the trailing rope ladder, to grab hold of it without being plucked out of the dinghy. For the umpteenth time they tacked into position, only to be forced back. At one time they ended up with their mast under the boom, and as the wave jerked them up, the mast caught under the boom and released it from its cradle. These booms are about 20 feet long and over 2 feet in circumference. It swung round and smashed against the ship's side, which brought a muted cheer from the onlookers. I say muted because that crash heralded the irate face of the commander peering over the side, and a stream of shouts emanating from his now reddening face as he could visualize the ship's gleaming paintwork being chipped off. They had then to make their way to the next forward boom, with a trailing group of watchers, both official and some, frankly, stirrers of the boiling pot. Here the trailing rope and rope ladders were adjacent. Terry managed to mount the ladder, while this time holding on to the bowline. With this he could let it out and pull it in, so that the pulley was directly over the dinghy. Terry's friend shackled on, and the crane driver took up the weight. Now he and the boat were hoisted up onto the deck, with a loud cheer from all the faces filling the portholes all along the ship's side. We were very, very careful after that. During Terry's time aboard the ship, the captain of the Marines asked him what his job was before joining up, and when he heard Terry was a trained artist, he lost no time in asking for a picture of his wife to be sketched. This soon brought in many requests, which, although bringing him in much wanted cash, prevented him from going ashore. However, what it did do is to have him transferred to the painting stores section, where he was placed under the chief petty officer, whose part-time job was painting ships' crests. These ships' crests were made of moulded, painted and gilded plaster of Paris, and were ordered by the ship's captain to present to visiting dignitaries or similar officials when the ship put into home port or ports abroad. These presentation plaques were extremely well made and finely decorated. No expense was spared to ensure that they were perfectly produced. Any gilt was in gold leaf, and the final operation was a coating of varnish. The remainder of his time aboard was served in the paint store, except when detailed off for watchkeeping as corporal of the Gangway, first making sure that a store of plaques had been put by ready for issue. His other call to fame was when the ship called at Trondheim, Norway, and a ship's band was called for. As a drummer in the boys' brigade, he found himself roped into this scratch band to augment the ship's Royal Marine buglers, who were also drummers. Thankfully, this was a one-off, and his skills with the sticks were not asked for again. During one of Terry's leaves from Illustrius, his father's Masonic lodge held its annual dinner and dance. He invited Terry along to make up a party of 3. They made their way to the Clarendon, meeting up with his father's friend Nobby Clark, his wife and daughter, at whose table they all sat. Naturally, Terry danced with the daughter, who told him that she worked for a legal secretary in London. How he came to pluck up sufficient courage to ask her out, we'll never know, but he did, and so a relationship blossomed, even after telling him that she was officially engaged to a chap who was out in Australia. That year, Stan married after courting his fiancée Jean for over a year. Stan was 20 and Jean 18, both far too young to be thinking of making lifetime decisions. The marriage ceremony was conducted at the Methodist Church, North Harrow. Stan was not sure that getting married at such an early age was wise, asking me if he thought he was doing the right thing. I stupidly replied, saying that he was being the best man. He felt he was a little late in starting to question his promises. In 1954, after a visit to Aberdeen in June, HMS Illustrius was taken out of service, destined for the Breakers' Yard. She had seen much service during the war, bombed and patched up in America before serving in the Pacific Fleet. Again, Terry had to choose where he was going to go within the Corps. A chance invitation was offered for interested parties to apply for the Amphibious wing at Poole, Dorset, which was now the main school for infantry landing craft, beach control, small boat work and raiding parties. Terry's request was duly accepted, and off he went to Poole to do a stoker's course, the aim of which was to produce engine room mechanics. At Poole, Terry learnt about the maintenance of Ford marine engines. The stoker of an infantry landing craft sits between 2 inline engines, with the 2 propeller shafts spinning either side. 2 levers engage the drive for forward and reverse, and the throttles connected to the carburetors determined the revolutions. The telegraphs were placed on the bulkhead either side of the armoured door, which is clamped shut during a landing, so too the round hatch above his head. The speed of a landing craft auxiliary LC-3 was about 11 knots. However, the craft was extremely active in rough water, and because of its slab side, easily affected by a strong wind blowing on the craft's quarters during a landing. As an analogy, you might imagine going to sea in a tin bath. It was not something you would wish to be in when landing on an enemy shore covered by well dug-in heavy machine guns, especially when you might be engaged kedging on or off the beach whilst worrying about the 30 or so troops waiting to land. It was equally difficult to take on troops and disembark onto a heaving troopship which towers above your head. With just 4 months left before becoming demobbed, Terry was asked to present himself to the beach control section to join their small branch. Now all his days were taken up signalling, sorting out beach signs and learning how to set up a beach landing position on an enemy shore. These were probably his most interesting days during his entire national service, days spent discussing various beach conditions which might have to be dealt with, visualizing every possible attack variation from pebble beaches to cliff sides. His 3 months were soon over, having to report to Eastney Barracks for discharge, to return to work and complete a further 6 months in the volunteers. 6 years in the volunteers.